Ladies and gentlemen, the title of my presentation is "A Way Out of the Present Crisis Between the West," means EU, USA on one side, and other countries, and Russia. Maybe it's too optimistic, but without optimism and without strong belief in the future of this relationship between EU and Russia, the creation of wider or greater or larger Europe, we must be in a very dangerous situation here in Europe and very unsatisfactory solution. Therefore, we have to believe in it and we have to work in this direction. The State Secretary said a while ago that diplomats are paid optimists. I'm no longer paid, I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, but I remain strongly optimistic. A year and a half has passed since the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of a hybrid war in Eastern Europe. This is beginning, in my view, of the acute crisis between the West and Russia. Maybe problems are older and started much earlier. The EU and the USA and other countries reacted to what they considered to be serious violations of international law and of CSC-OSCE principles by imposing economic sanctions. Russia responded with counter-sanctions. As a consequence, relations between the West and Russia have fallen to the lowest level for decades. Although channels of communication between Russia and leading Western countries remain open, slava bogu, even at the highest political level, the political climate is marked by distrust, mutual accusations, and a lack of readiness to compromise. For Russia, the regime change which occurred in Kiev on 21st February 2014 was a coup d'etat inspired and supported by the USA and other Western countries. The aim of this interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine was to weaken Russia by harming its economic, political, and security interests. From a Western perspective, this looked quite differently. Russia's violent reaction to a democratic revolution in Kiev was explained by a desire to restore a sphere of influence in its neighborhood. The legal opinion that the reunification of Crimea with Russia, as it is called by the Kremlin, was carried out in conformity with international law is not shared by any other country, even not by Russia's closest friends, such as China. Since it is unlikely that Russia and Ukraine will renounce to their contradictory claims and mutually exclusive claims on Crimea, the legal controversy will continue and end in a stalemate. However, in spite of the disputed status of Crimea, which is for Europe, the USA, and many other countries the result of the most flagrant violation of Europe's peace and security order, many political observers in Europe would agree that a de-escalation of tensions is urgently needed. In this context, one should remember the example of the 35 CSC participating states, which agreed 40 years ago that the political and territorial status quo in Europe has to be respected, but can be changed peacefully if so agreed. This works in both ways. A lot of trust accumulated over the past decades between Russia and the West has been lost due to the events related to Ukraine. It will probably take a long time to restore the previous level of trust, and this can only be achieved gradually in a step-by-step process. Given the dangerous level that tensions between Russia and the West have already reached, no time should be lost to launch such a process. Military incidents resulting from a miscalculation, misinterpretation of activities of the other side could easily escalate into a military confrontation. Military contacts that were standard practice even during the Cold War no longer exist. In this tense atmosphere, it is utterly irresponsible to talk about the possible use of nuclear weapons. Such threats were unheard for many decades. How can tensions be reduced and a reasonable level of cooperation between Russia and the West be gradually restored? In my view, this requires a multifaceted approach. First, the most urgent task is to defuse the crisis in Ukraine. The only existing framework for a peaceful settlement of the conflict in eastern Ukraine is the Minsk process, based on the agreements reached by the political leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France in the Belarusian capital on 12th of February. The military provisions of Minsk II, the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the so-called contact line, have been more or less implemented by the Ukrainian army and the rebel forces, although frequent violations of the agreed ceasefire were registered by the OSCE monitoring mission until the end of August, when the ceasefire commitment was reconfirmed, and we all heard and read that even President Poroshenko said yesterday, I believe, that the 11th of September, yesterday, was the first day when there was no shooting in the eastern part of Ukraine. But much more complicated is the implementation of the political provisions of Minsk II. To take just one example, paragraph 4 on local self-governments in certain districts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast is differently interpreted by Kiev and the separatists. In addition, the Ukrainian government does not recognize the separatists as legitimate representatives of the population living in these districts and is therefore not willing to discuss with them the necessary amendments to the Ukrainian constitution. During a night-long negotiation in Minsk last February, President Poroshenko agreed to commitments which are extremely unpopular in his country, in large segments of this population, such as autonomy for the districts controlled by separatists, pardon and amnesty. France and Germany have, over the past month, continuously exerted discreet pressure on the Kiev government to accept compromises in implementing the rather vague political provisions of Minsk II. But to no avail. Kiev only responded positively when a US representative demanded in July flexibility in drafting the constitutional amendment on regional self-governance. According to the compromise formula adopted by the Verkhovna Rada, the amount of autonomy granted to the eastern districts will not be defined in the text of the constitution as demanded by the separatists, but in a separate law to which the constitution refers. Since July, it seemed that Washington is more actively interested in the implementation of Minsk II and that Moscow is reducing its material support for the separatists. Indeed, political observers expect that the nuclear deal with Iran will have positive influence on the overall relationship between the USA and Russia. However, it remains to be seen how this will impact efforts to defuse the Ukraine crisis. An important test case will be the forthcoming local elections in Ukraine end of October that are to be held over all the country. That means also in the eastern districts in accordance with Ukrainian legislation. Unfortunately, the Ukraine peace process is not yet irreversible. This has to be said in clear terms. The EU, the USA, and Russia must intensify their efforts to avoid a failure of Minsk II and a possible return to military options. Inspired by the successful outcome of the Vienna negotiations with Iran, some believe that the E3+3 or EU5+1 format should also be applied to the Ukraine crisis. I'm not sure about the role of China. China might play in this crisis, but an inclusion of the USA into efforts to settle the Ukraine crisis would be, in my view, have a very healthy effect. For Russia's self-esteem, it is of great importance to be treated by the USA as an equal partner, at least on all issues of strategic relevance. Disregard to this psychological rule was in the past very often the cause for tensions between Moscow and Washington, which also affected relations between Russia and the EU. This is automatically linked. President Putin's famous outcry at the Munich Security Conference in February 2007 marked the beginning of Russia's new policy of assertiveness, especially vis-à-vis the USA. Second, let us hope for an optimistic scenario. If all major elements of Minsk II are implemented by the separatists, the Ukrainian government, and Russia, the economic sanctions imposed by the USA, the EU, and other countries should be removed swiftly. Only sanctions related to the annexation of Crimea should remain in force. The USA might be more hesitant in this respect. Therefore, the EU must take the lead in removing sanctions as soon as the situation in eastern Ukraine has irreversibly improved and the sovereignty of Ukraine restored in the eastern part of the country. The present economic sanctions and counter-sanctions have a detrimental effect on the economies of several EU countries, but first of all on the economic development of Russia. They reinforce negative trends in the Russian economy, which are the result of low energy prices and a serious backlog of reforms. I recommend reading an article by Oleg Vukovich, I'm sure you know him, director of the Economic Policy Center of the Moscow State University, MGU, on myths and realities of sanctions in Russia. I wish to emphasize that the EU has no interest whatsoever to destabilize the Russian economy. On the contrary, the prosperity of Russia is a prerequisite for prosperity and political stability in all parts of wider Europe, including the EU, of course. The normalization of trade and economic cooperation between the EU and Russia will be easy because both sides are just waiting for it. In an interview with Slovenian TV, Prime Minister Medvedev declared in early July that Russia's move toward China does not mean that Russia no longer values its economic ties with Europe. China is just another vector of cooperation. End of quotation. Indeed, Russia's pivot towards Asia does not mean that Europe is no longer Russia's #1 economic partner. The economies of the EU countries and Russia complement each other. And contrary to other economic powers, the EU does not consider Russia merely as a provider of raw materials. Through its direct investments, Europe offers Russia access to modern technology. Thus, Europe remains for Russia what it already was for many centuries, a gateway to modernization, innovation, and progress. In this context, let me quote Yevgeny Yasin, who said in a recent interview with the Austrian daily Die Presse that Russia would lose its importance if it turns towards China. But if it moves into the future hand in hand with Europe, the importance of both Russia and Europe in global affairs will grow. Normalization of trade and economic cooperation between the EU and Russia will be followed sooner or later by a resumption of negotiations on a new basic agreement, regulating the whole spectrum of relations between the EU and Russia. In parallel with the drafting of a new basic agreement, as it was said already before, a dialogue should be launched regarding a possible free trade arrangement between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union. Furthermore, all countries in wider Europe should be free to apply for membership in one or the other organization or to conclude an association agreement with one of them. Thus, the vision of a huge area of free trade and economic cooperation based on a wide network of treaties stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean would become a reality. Third, irrespective of positive developments, which will hopefully occur in the near future between Russia and the West, the annexation of Crimea will remain an open wound. It will be a constant reminder of fundamental differences over key issues of European security. Obviously, such differences represent an element of instability in Europe. Therefore, it is necessary to reaffirm all norms and principles of the CSC, OSCE, adopted since the Helsinki summit in August 75. An opportunity to do this has unfortunately been missed at the recent 40th anniversary of the signing of the CSC Final Act in August. Now, great hopes are linked, as Igor Jürgen said it before, to the German OSCE presidency in 2016, followed by the Austrian presidency a year later. The reaffirmation of the existing rules. We don't have to invent new rules. We have to apply the existing rules. Reaffirmation of the existing rules should be used in order to refine, not dilute, but refine and reinforce some of the OSCE commitments. A security environment must be created in the OSCE area in which Russia and all the other OSCE countries feel at ease. They have, irrespective of their size, a right to equal security. Obviously, the security environment will be strongly influenced by the relationship between NATO and Russia, which should be fundamentally improved. This will only be possible if Moscow and Washington consider each other again as partners in world affairs and not as adversaries. Fourth, the recent nuclear deal with Iran is an encouraging sign that the USA and Russia are still able to put aside rivalries and long-lasting differences in order to find pragmatic solutions to burning international problems. Syria and the fight against the Islamic State is already the next test case for strategic cooperation between Russia and the USA. Let me remind that military support for a criminal regime in Syria would not be the way to stability and peace there. We have to work together by military means to establish a new Syrian leadership through possibly a transitional inclusion of parts of the old regime. Europe and the USA have understood, further successes in global cooperation between the two major nuclear powers will hopefully have a positive impact on the situation in Ukraine. This remains just a hope. In an interview with Swiss media on 28 July, President Putin stated the following: "Today, the situation has changed. Europe and the USA have understood that the real threat is coming from radicalism. They have joined us in this struggle. We need to be patient and work with our American colleagues in looking for solutions. This has already happened with the Iranian nuclear problem. Russia and the USA need to revitalize their work at the UN Security Council." End of quotation. Whatever the reasons for this possible change of mind in the West but also in Russia might be, what counts is that it will hopefully happen. Dear friends, let me conclude by emphasizing that there is no place in today's world for ideologically driven foreign policies. Such policies are unsustainable in the long term. Pragmatism and realism are necessary to preserve peace and promote cooperation all over the world. This must be kept in mind when we try to restore cooperation and a climate of trust in our wider Europe. Thank you.